If you clicked on this video, something in you already knows, not hopes, not suspects, knows that there's a technique so simple, so fundamental, so perfectly aligned with how the quantum field actually operates that once you learn it, once you truly embody it, your reality cannot remain the same. Not because you'll force change through willpower or manifestation rituals, but because you'll be operating from the actual mechanics of reality creation at quantum level, and those mechanics are ruthlessly precise. They don't care about your doubts or your past or your current circumstances. They only care about one thing: what you're doing right now, in this moment, with your consciousness. The technique isn't new. Ancient mystics knew it. Quantum physicists have proven it mathematically. Spiritual masters have taught versions of it across every tradition, but it's been obscured by complicated teachings, hidden behind spiritual jargon, buried under techniques that make manifestation seem difficult when it's actually the most natural thing consciousness does. And if these words found you, if something magnetic pulled your attention here, if you can feel that subtle recognition stirring beneath your awareness, you're about to remember what you've always been capable of, but were never taught to access consciously. Here's what makes this technique different from everything else you've tried. It doesn't require belief. It doesn't require faith. It doesn't require you to convince yourself that something is true when your current experience seems to prove otherwise. The technique works whether you believe in it or not, because it's not based on belief. It's based on quantum mechanics, on the actual laws that govern how consciousness interfaces with the field of infinite possibility to collapse specific outcomes into manifestation. You've been using these laws your entire life, unconsciously, automatically, creating through them without knowing what you were doing. The technique simply makes conscious what was unconscious. Can you feel that shift happening already? That subtle dropping in? That's not psychological. That's quantum. Your consciousness recognizing truth before your mind can analyze it. That recognition, that immediate knowing that what you're about to learn matters at fundamental level, that's your awareness touching the technique itself. Not as information separate from you, but as capacity that's always existed within your consciousness, waiting for the moment when you'd be ready to use it deliberately rather than accidentally. Quantum physics reveals something devastating to conventional manifestation teaching. Particles don't exist in definite states until they're observed. Before observation, they exist in superposition, simultaneously in all possible states. The electron isn't here or there, it's here and there and everywhere else, all at once, until the moment consciousness observes it and collapses that infinite possibility into single, definite location. This isn't metaphor. This isn't spiritual philosophy. This is verified, repeatable, laboratory-proven reality. Consciousness doesn't discover where the particle is. Consciousness determines where the particle is through the act of observation. Now apply that to your life, to your circumstances, to everything you call reality. Before you observe it, before you collapse it into specific form through your consciousness, it exists in superposition. All possibilities existing simultaneously. The relationship that works perfectly, the health that's completely restored, the abundance that flows effortlessly, the life that feels aligned and purposeful. These aren't distant futures you need to create through years of effort. They're present possibilities existing right now in the quantum field, waiting for your consciousness to observe them into manifestation. The technique teaches you how to observe, not casually, not habitually, not through the filters and conditioning and past patterns that have been unconsciously determining what you collapse into experience, but consciously, deliberately, with precision, in ways that collapse the probabilities you actually want rather than the ones your conditioning has been automatically manifesting your entire life without your awareness. Take a breath, a deep one, because what you're about to learn isn't just technique, it's initiation. Once you see how observation actually works, once you understand what you've been doing unconsciously, once you learn to do it consciously, there's no going back. You can't unknow it. You can't pretend you don't see what you see. You become responsible for what you create, which is both the most terrifying and most liberating recognition consciousness can have. You've always been creating your reality. Now you're about to learn how to do it consciously. Before we go into the actual technique itself, you need to understand why every other manifestation method you've tried has failed or worked inconsistently. Not because there's something wrong with you, not because you're not spiritual enough or your vibration isn't high enough, but because most manifestation teaching misses the single most crucial element of how quantum mechanics actually functions. They teach you to visualize, to affirm, to set intentions, to feel the feeling of having what you desire. And all of that can work, sometimes. But it's inconsistent because it's missing the foundation. The foundation is this: observation isn't passive. This is where 99% of manifestation teaching goes wrong. They treat observation as if you're watching a movie that's already filmed, just perceiving what's there. But quantum mechanics proves the opposite. Observation is active, creative, determinative. The observer doesn't just witness reality. The observer participates in creating reality through the specific way consciousness observes. You're not finding out what's there. You're determining what's there through how you observe. Most people observe reality through filters they don't know exist. Filters installed by childhood conditioning, by cultural programming, by past experiences that convinced consciousness that reality works a certain way. And those filters determine what you can perceive, which determines what you can collapse into experience. If your filters only allow you to see limitation, then limitation is what you'll manifest. Not because limitation is all that exists, but because limitation is all you can observe, and you can only collapse into experience what you're capable of observing. The technique begins here, becoming aware of how you're observing, not what you're observing. That's content, that's already manifested reality. But how? The quality of your observation, the assumptions embedded in your perceiving, the invisible filters that have been determining your entire experienced reality without you knowing they were operating. You can't change what you can't see. You can't shift what remains unconscious. The technique starts by making conscious what was unconscious, showing you how you've been observing so you can begin observing differently. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because when you become aware of how you've been observing, you start to see how you've been creating your own limitations, how your observation patterns have been collapsing the exact circumstances you've been complaining about, how your unconscious filters have been manifesting the very things you consciously say you don't want. This isn't about blame or guilt. This is about power. Because once you see how you've been unconsciously creating what you don't want, you can learn to consciously create what you do want. Think about your current reality, the parts that aren't working, the circumstances that feel stuck, the patterns that keep repeating. What if those aren't happening to you? What if those are happening through you? Through unconscious observation patterns that keep collapsing the same probabilities over and over, because you're observing through the same filters over and over. The quantum field doesn't judge your observation. It doesn't decide whether you should manifest limitation or abundance. It simply responds to how you're observing by collapsing probabilities that match your observation pattern. Here's what this means practically. You don't need to change your circumstances. You need to change how you're observing your circumstances, because when observation shifts, manifestation shifts automatically, not eventually, not after you've done enough inner work or raised your vibration sufficiently, immediately. In the quantum moment where new observation collapses different probability into experience. This is why some people manifest instantly, while others struggle for years using the same techniques. The difference isn't in the technique, The difference is in how conscious they are of their observation patterns. The second layer most manifestation teaching misses is this: you're always observing, always. You don't observe reality only during your morning visualization practice or when you're consciously trying to manifest. You observe reality every moment you're conscious, and every moment of observation is collapsing probabilities. Most people spend 5 minutes consciously trying to manifest abundance, then spend the other 23 hours and 55 minutes unconsciously observing through filters of limitation, lack, and past patterns. The quantum field doesn't respond to your 5 minutes of conscious manifestation. The quantum field responds to your predominant observation pattern, the way you observe most of the time. This is why the technique has to become constant. Not effortful, constant, natural. The way you breathe or your heart beats. Conscious observation has to shift from something you do occasionally to something you are continuously. That shift doesn't happen through discipline or trying harder. It happens through recognition, through seeing clearly how you've been observing unconsciously, which naturally begins to shift the observation because consciousness cannot remain unconscious of what it's seen clearly. There are specific signals that confirm the technique is beginning to work, that your observation patterns are shifting from unconscious to conscious, that the quantum field is responding to your new way of interfacing with reality. These aren't signs you need to create or force. They're natural phenomena that occur when consciousness starts operating from the actual mechanics of manifestation, rather than from conditioned patterns. And recognizing these signals, trusting what they show you, accelerates the technique's effectiveness exponentially. The first signal is reality responding faster. Things you observe consciously start manifesting with shocking speed. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to confirm that yes, observation is creative, yes, the technique is working, yes, you're beginning to collapse probabilities deliberately rather than accidentally. This happens because conscious observation is pure, focused, clear. Unconscious observation is diffused, contradictory, contaminated with conflicting beliefs. When you observe consciously, even for brief moments, the quantum field responds to that clarity by manifesting matching circumstances rapidly. The second signal is synchronicity intensification. Events align with precision that seems impossible if reality were truly random and external. The book you need appears. The person who has the answer contacts you. The opportunity that matches your observation manifests through channels that shouldn't logically connect. This is the quantum field revealing its unified nature, showing you that everything connects, everything coordinates, and your conscious observation is the organizing principle that determines how that coordination manifests around you. The third signal is old patterns becoming visible. Suddenly you're catching yourself observing through filters you never knew existed, noticing assumptions you've carried for decades without questioning them, seeing clearly how your unconscious observation has been creating circumstances you consciously didn't want. This isn't regression. This is breakthrough. Consciousness becoming aware of what was operating invisibly, which is the necessary first step toward shifting those patterns from unconscious automatic to conscious deliberate. The fourth signal is emotional release without cause. Grief or anger or fear arising not in response to circumstances, but as old observation patterns dissolve. When you shift how you observe, when you release filters that have been determining your reality for years or decades, there's emotional charge stored in those patterns. As they dissolve, that charge releases. Don't make it mean something's wrong. Don't try to figure out where it's coming from. Just let it move through and recognize it as confirmation that deep structures are shifting at quantum level. The fifth signal is that others notice changes before you do. People comment that you seem different. Circumstances shift in response to you in ways they didn't before. Opportunities appear that weren't available previously. This happens because you're emanating different quantum information as you shift your observation patterns. Others don't consciously know what changed. but they feel it, and the field organizes their responses to match your new way of being, your new way of observing, your new quantum signature. The sixth signal is increasing present moment awareness. You're naturally more here, more now, less lost in past or future. This occurs because conscious observation requires presence. You cannot observe consciously while mentally elsewhere. The technique automatically grounds you in present moment because present moment is where observation actually happens, where the quantum field actually responds, where probability waves actually collapse into manifestation. Write in the comments which signals you're experiencing. Just list them: faster manifestation or synchronicity or pattern visibility. That acknowledgement does something quantum. It stabilizes what's shifting. It makes conscious what was unconscious. It tells the field that yes, you're receiving the transmission, yes, the technique is activating, yes, you're ready for reality to change forever because you're changing how you observe reality at fundamental level. Now we arrive at the technique itself, the actual practice. The specific way to observe that collapses desired probabilities into manifestation rather than unconsciously repeating past patterns. This will seem almost too simple. Your mind will want it to be more complicated, more esoteric, more difficult. But quantum mechanics is simple, ruthlessly simple. Consciousness interfaces with field. Observation collapses probability. The complexity has been added by teachings that don't understand the actual mechanics. Strip away the complexity and what remains is elegant, direct, and devastatingly effective. The technique has 3 movements, not steps, movements, because they're not linear or sequential. They're simultaneous aspects of conscious observation that work together to collapse specific probabilities into experience. Think of them as 3 qualities of observation that need to be present simultaneously for the technique to work at full power. You can practice them individually at first, but eventually they merge into single unified act of conscious observation. The first movement is witness awareness. This is consciousness recognizing itself as the observer rather than identifying as what's being observed. Most people think they are their circumstances, their thoughts, their emotions, their body, but you're not any of those things. You're the consciousness observing those things. When you identify as the observed rather than as the observer, you lose creative power because you're trapped inside the manifestation rather than being the consciousness that's creating the manifestation through observation. Practice this now. Notice you're reading these words. Now notice the awareness that's noticing the reading. That awareness, that's you, not the thoughts about the reading, not the body that's holding the device, not the emotions arising as you read, but the consciousness that's aware of all of that. That awareness never changes. It's been the same your entire life, even though everything it observes has constantly changed. That unchanging awareness is what you actually are. And that awareness is what has creative power, because that awareness is what observes, and observation is what collapses probability waves into manifestation. When you stabilize in witness awareness, when you recognize yourself as consciousness rather than as content of consciousness, something profound shifts. You're no longer trapped inside your circumstances, trying to change them from within. You're the consciousness observing circumstances, which means you have power to observe differently and thereby collapse different circumstances. This isn't metaphor. This is quantum mechanics. The observer is not part of the observed system. The observer is what determines the observed system through the act of observation. The second movement is assumption shift. Once you're established as witness awareness, once you recognize yourself as the observer rather than the observed, you can consciously choose what assumptions you observe from. Most people observe from unconscious assumptions installed by past experience. They assume reality works a certain way because it's always worked that way before. But past patterns only repeat because you're observing from assumptions that create those patterns. When you shift the assumption, when you observe from different premise about how reality works, the quantum field responds by collapsing different probabilities that match your new assumption. Here's how this works practically. Instead of observing your bank account from the assumption, money is difficult to generate, observe from the assumption, the universe provides abundantly for all my needs. Not as affirmation you're trying to believe, as assumption you're observing from. There's a difference. Affirmation is trying to convince yourself. Assumption is the premise from which you're observing. When you observe from assumption of abundance, you literally perceive different possibilities, which means you can collapse different probabilities, which means different circumstances manifest. The key is, the assumption has to be genuine. You can't fake it or force it. This is why the first movement, witness awareness, is crucial. When you're identified with circumstances, you can't shift assumptions because circumstances seem to prove your current assumptions true. But when you're established as witness awareness, when you recognize you're the consciousness observing rather than the circumstances being observed, you naturally have space to choose different assumptions because you're not trapped inside the reality those assumptions are creating. The third movement is quantum feeling. This is the most misunderstood aspect of manifestation. Most teachings say, feel as if you already have it. But that creates pretending, which creates resistance because you know you're pretending. Quantum feeling is different. It's not feeling as if you have it in the future. It's feeling the quantum reality of it existing now as probability wave, not physically manifested yet, but existing as real potential in the field, just waiting for your observation to collapse it into form. Can you feel the difference? One is fake it till you make it, which never works sustainably. The other is recognizing that what you desire already exists as quantum potential and feeling into that reality. Not the physical manifestation, but the quantum truth that in superposition, all possibilities exist simultaneously. Your desired reality is just as real as your current reality. It's just existing as probability wave rather than as collapsed form. Quantum feeling is feeling into that probability wave, which begins to collapse it toward manifestation, because feeling is a form of observation, and observation is what collapses probability waves. 5 years ago, I discovered this technique in the midst of complete financial collapse. Everything I'd built was dissolving, debt accumulating, no clear path forward. And in desperation, I stopped trying to manifest my way out. Stopped visualizing, stopped affirming, stopped all the techniques I'd learned. And in that stopping, in that emptiness, something emerged. Not as teaching from outside, but as recognition from within. A knowing about how consciousness actually creates reality that was so simple, so obvious, I couldn't believe I'd missed it for decades. The knowing was this: I'd been observing my circumstances as fixed reality that I was trying to change. But what if circumstances weren't fixed? What if they were just collapsed probability waves, one possible manifestation out of infinite possibilities, and they only seemed fixed because I kept observing them as fixed? What if I could observe them differently? Not pretend they were different, but literally observe from different assumptions, different witness position, different quantum feeling about what was actually possible. I started practicing the 3 movements. First, establishing myself as witness awareness, the consciousness observing the financial situation rather than being the person trapped in the situation. That shift alone created space where before there was only claustrophobic panic. Then, shifting assumptions, instead of observing from, this is a disaster that proves I'm a failure, observing from, this is quantum reorganization, creating space for something new to emerge. Not believing it, observing from it. And third, quantum feeling. Feeling into the probability wave of financial abundance, not as distant future but as present potential existing right now in superposition, just waiting to collapse into form. Within 3 weeks, Circumstances shifted so dramatically that logic couldn't explain it. Money appeared through channels that shouldn't have connected. Opportunities manifested that didn't exist in the previous probability field. The situation didn't gradually improve. It quantum leaped into completely different configuration. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the shift hadn't happened through time or effort or luck. It had happened through conscious observation, through learning to use the three movements to collapse different probabilities than the ones my unconscious patterns had been automatically manifesting. After that breakthrough, I became obsessed with understanding the mechanics precisely, studying quantum physics, testing the technique in different areas, refining the movements until they became natural, effortless, constant, rather than occasional practice. And what I discovered was revolutionary. Manifestation isn't difficult because the universe is withholding. Manifestation is difficult because we're unconscious of how we're observing. We're collapsing the same probabilities repeatedly through habitual observation patterns and then wondering why reality keeps manifesting the same circumstances. The technique doesn't give you new power. You've always had the power. Your consciousness. You're the observer. You're what collapses probability waves through the act of observation. The technique just makes conscious what was unconscious, shows you how you've been using your creative power accidentally, automatically, habitually, and once you see it, once you understand the mechanics, you can't unknow it. You can only choose whether to keep observing unconsciously or to start observing consciously, using the three movements to deliberately collapse the probabilities you actually desire. This is what I wish someone had shown me decades earlier. That manifestation isn't about techniques or rituals or convincing yourself to believe things that seem untrue. Manifestation is about observation, pure, simple, quantum mechanical observation. You're always observing. You're always collapsing probabilities. The only question is, are you doing it consciously or unconsciously? Are you observing from assumptions you chose or from assumptions you inherited? Are you established as witness awareness or identified with circumstances? Are you feeling quantum potential or just hoping for future change? Your path will be different from mine. Your breakthrough might come through insight rather than crisis. But the mechanics are the same. The technique is the same. The three movements work for everyone because they're not based on belief or spirituality or positive thinking. They're based on how consciousness actually interfaces with the quantum field to collapse probability waves into definite manifestation. This is science. Proven, repeatable, laboratory-verified science. The only difference is, now you're learning to use that science consciously rather than remaining unconscious of the process that's been creating your reality all along. Now that you understand the three movements, the question becomes, how do you practice them until they become natural? How do you shift from occasionally remembering to observe consciously to observing consciously as your baseline, your default, your constant mode of interfacing with reality? Because understanding the technique intellectually is different from embodying it as lived experience. An embodiment is where permanent transformation occurs. The practice begins the moment you finish this video. Not tomorrow. Not after you've prepared or studied more or feel ready. Now. Because every moment you delay is another moment of unconscious observation. Another moment of automatically collapsing probabilities based on past patterns. Another moment where the quantum field responds to your habitual way of observing rather than to conscious, deliberate observation using the three movements. Start with witness awareness, because this is the foundation everything else builds on. Multiple times throughout your day, set alarms if needed, pause and notice. Who is aware of this moment? Not what you're experiencing. Who is experiencing it? That consciousness that's aware of thoughts, aware of emotions, aware of circumstances, aware of the body. That's you. Not the content of awareness. The awareness itself. Each time you recognize yourself as awareness rather than as content, you strengthen witness consciousness. You stabilize as observer rather than observed. When you catch yourself identified with circumstances, I'm stressed, I'm broke, I'm stuck. Notice the identification and shift to witness position. I'm the awareness observing stress. I'm the consciousness watching thoughts about money. I'm the observer noticing the sensation of feeling stuck. This isn't spiritual bypassing or denying what you're experiencing. This is recognizing what you actually are. Consciousness observing experience rather than being the experience. And that recognition is what gives you power to observe differently, which gives you power to collapse different probabilities. The second practice is assumption tracking. Throughout your day, catch the assumptions you're observing from. When you look at your bank account, what assumption are you observing from? When you think about your health, your relationships, your career, what assumptions underlie your observation? Most people have never consciously identified their assumptions because assumptions are invisible. They're the lens you look through, not the thing you look at. But once you start catching them, once you make them conscious, you realize, I'm creating my reality from these assumptions. And if these assumptions aren't serving me, I can choose different ones. Here's the practice. When you notice an assumption that's limiting, money is hard to make, healing takes time, relationships require struggle, don't fight it. Don't try to replace it with positive affirmation, just observe it. Watch the assumption like you'd watch a cloud passing through sky. Notice that it's not truth. It's just assumption. And in that noticing, in that simple recognition that what you thought was reality is actually just assumption, the assumption begins to lose its power to determine your observation. Space opens for different assumptions to emerge naturally. The third practice is quantum feeling cultivation. Several times each day, for just 60 seconds, feel into the probability wave of what you're manifesting. Not the physical form, the quantum potential. Feel into the truth that in superposition, your desired reality already exists, not in the future. Not as something you need to create, but as present probability wave in the quantum field right now. This isn't imagination. This is quantum mechanics. The electron exists in all possible locations until observed. Your desired reality exists in all possible forms until your observation collapses it into specific manifestation. What does this feeling feel like? Not excitement about future, not hope that something will come, but recognition, certainty. The same feeling you have about your current reality. Not emotional enthusiasm, just simple knowing that it is. Practice that knowing feeling about the probability wave, not about the manifested form that creates attachment and resistance, but about the quantum reality that it exists as possibility right now. That feeling, sustained even for moments, begins collapsing that probability wave toward manifestation, because feeling is observation, and observation is what collapses probability. These practices aren't meant to be perfect. You'll forget. You'll spend hours unconscious before remembering to observe consciously. You'll catch assumptions too late after you've already observed from them and collapsed probabilities you didn't want. You'll struggle to feel quantum reality when circumstances seem to prove it doesn't exist. All of this is natural. All of this is part of the learning process. Consciousness doesn't shift from unconscious to conscious instantly. It shifts gradually, through repeated practice, through continuous return to the three movements, no matter how many times you lose them. Something crucial happens after you begin practicing the technique consistently that most people don't expect and many aren't prepared for. Your old reality starts collapsing before your new reality fully manifests. Circumstances that were stable become unstable. Relationships that were comfortable become uncomfortable. Situations that were tolerable become intolerable. And in that gap, In that space between what was and what's emerging, there's profound uncertainty that can feel like the technique isn't working when actually it's working perfectly. This is what I call the quantum gap. The period where old probability patterns are dissolving because you're no longer observing from the assumptions that were maintaining them. But new probability patterns haven't fully manifested yet into physical form. In quantum mechanics, before a new state manifests, the old state must first decohere, must first lose its stability, its coherence, its seeming solidity. That decoherence is what you experience as things falling apart, as old structures crumbling, as previous certainties becoming uncertain. Most people panic in the quantum gap. They think something's wrong. They think the technique is making things worse. They think they should return to old observation patterns, at least those were familiar. At least those felt safe, even if they were limiting. But returning to old observation patterns in the quantum gap is like stopping antibiotics halfway through treatment. You've already disrupted the old patterns enough that they're unstable, but you haven't maintained conscious observation long enough for new patterns to fully stabilize. You end up trapped between worlds, old reality collapsing, new reality not yet manifest. The quantum gap requires something most spiritual teachings don't emphasize enough: trust. Not blind faith or positive thinking or pretending everything's fine when it's clearly not. But trust in the mechanics themselves. Trust that when observation shifts, manifestation must shift, because observation determines manifestation. The gap between when you start observing consciously and when new reality fully manifests isn't evidence that the technique isn't working. The gap is necessary. It's the quantum field reorganizing probabilities, decohering old patterns, establishing new configurations that match your new observation patterns. During my financial collapse, the quantum gap lasted about 6 weeks. 6 weeks where the old financial reality was completely dissolving, income disappearing, debts mounting, no clear path forward. But the new financial reality hadn't manifested yet into tangible form. Every day I had to consciously practice the 3 movements. Establish witness awareness so I wasn't trapped inside the collapsing circumstances. Observe from new assumptions even when circumstances seemed to prove those assumptions were delusional. Feel into quantum probability of abundance even when physical reality screamed scarcity. Those 6 weeks were the most difficult spiritual practice I've ever encountered. Not because the technique was hard, the movements are simple, but because maintaining conscious observation while physical reality seems to be collapsing requires something most people don't have: willingness to trust quantum mechanics more than you trust physical evidence. To trust that observation creates reality more than you trust that reality is already fixed. To trust the invisible process of probability wave collapse more than you trust the visible circumstances that are dissolving. But here's what I learned in that gap. The dissolution is necessary. You cannot manifest new reality while maintaining old observation patterns. And old observation patterns are encoded in the stable structures of your current reality, your routines, your relationships, your circumstances. When you shift observation, when you start using the 3 movements consciously, those structures lose their stability because they were being maintained by unconscious observation. They have to dissolve so new structures that match conscious observation can form. The quantum gap isn't failure. The quantum gap is transition. It's the space between old probability configuration collapsing and new probability configuration stabilizing. And the only way through it is to maintain conscious observation even when, especially when, circumstances seem to prove that conscious observation isn't working. Because what you're seeing as failure is actually the old reality dying, and that death is necessary for new reality to birth. If you're in the quantum gap right now, if things are falling apart while you're practicing the technique, don't abandon the practice. This is where most people fail. This is where they return to unconscious observation, because at least unconscious observation created familiar reality, even if it was limiting. But if you maintain conscious observation through the gap, if you keep practicing the three movements even while old structures dissolve, you'll emerge on the other side into manifestation that matches your conscious observation rather than your unconscious patterns. And that manifestation will be stable because it's built on conscious observation rather than on unconscious habits. What's happening to you individually as you learn this technique is happening to millions globally. This isn't random. This isn't isolated awakening. We're in the midst of species-wide shift from unconscious creation to conscious manifestation, where enough humans are simultaneously learning to observe consciously that the collective field itself is transforming. Where quantum techniques that were once hidden in mystery schools are becoming accessible to anyone ready to learn the actual mechanics of reality creation. Rupert Sheldrake's research on morphic resonance proves that when enough individuals in a species learn new behavior, that learning becomes easier for all members through resonance in the collective field. The first humans who learned conscious observation had to discover the technique without guidance, without confirmation, without any evidence that quantum mechanics could be used practically. But each person who learns the technique now makes it easier for others. The morphic field contains the pattern of conscious observation, and that pattern is strengthening. You're not pioneering this shift. You're benefiting from everyone who came before. Quantum physicists who proved observer effect is real. Mystics who taught that consciousness creates reality. Practitioners who tested these